Hey, ladies and gentlemen. So this week we're going to be looking at some writings by Elizabeth Browning. And we're going to be reading two of her poems this week. How Do I Love Thee, which is probably her most famous sonnet, and honestly probably one of the most famous sonnets of any English individual, especially during this time period. And we're going to read The Cry of the Children. So some basic facts about Browning. Her name is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Barrett would be her maiden name. She was born into a family of considerable wealth. This wealth came from the family's owning of slave plantations in Jamaica. After the abolishment of slavery in 1833, her father lost a lot of money, and they ended up selling off the house that she grew up in. They had a kind of country house in England that they had to sell off when he lost so much money because of slavery being abolished, and then there were lots of lawsuits that stemmed from that. She was well educated, unlike most women at the time period, because she kind of threw herself upon her brother's tutor and learned from her. She studied Latin and Greek, and she learned to read Hebrew, and she read basically anything that she could get her hands on. Her first book of poetry was published at the age of 13. She did have a very controlling father who never allowed his children to marry as long as he was alive. She was still 39, living with her father, who was at the time an invalid. He couldn't function on his own. And she was kind of sequestered into a country home with him and her siblings, where she wasn't allowed to really get out and talk to people and meet people. But she did publish poetry, and through the poetry, Robert Browning wrote her a letter kind of telling her how great he thought her poetry was and how wonderful he was. And they corresponded quite often after that, back and forth, and they fell in love in this way. And in 1846, the two secretly eloped to Italy, made the father very angry, and he ended up disowning her. But they were happy. They had a son together named Penn, and they lived together in Italy until she passed away in 1861. So The Cry of the Children, this was written after reading a report of a parliamentary commission that talked about the labor of children in mines and factories. She was very, Elizabeth Browning was very, what do I want to say? She cared a lot about what was going on in the government, and she was at the forefront of a lot of decisions that were made at the time, and a lot of the reform bills that came out regarding women and regarding children and equality and lifestyles for everyone. And so this poem is a pretty good reflection of that. What I want you to think about as you're reading this poem, why does the speaker compare the lives of young animals with the lives of children? I want you to think about the irony of this comparison. I want you to think about the landscape that she describes, both the landscape background of the young animals and then the landscape background of the lives of the children. And I want you to think about that irony and the comparison that she's making between the two. And I want you to think about the sounds that she describes with both too. What are the sounds like when she's referring to the animals, and what are the sounds like when she's referring to the children? And I really want you to focus on those things and that comparison between the two, and determine what is Elizabeth Browning really trying to say with this poem. The other poem that you're going to be reading is How Do I Love Thee? This is part of a book of poems called the Sonnets from the Portuguese, and it's actually a reflection of her love story with her husband, how the different stages that her love for her husband went through throughout their life together. And this is sonnet number 43, and it is her best known sonnet, and it's probably the most famous sonnet of this time period without much doubt referring to that. But I want you to think about, what is the speaker's thoughts on the power of love? How does the poet use nature to describe her love? And what does the speaker say about death and love? And so those are the things that I really want you to kind of keep in mind as you read the poem. It's very short, but I think you're going to enjoy it. If you have any questions about this week's readings or any trouble doing any of the assignments for this week, please do not hesitate to stop by, ask me in class, or send me an email. Y'all have a great rest of your day.